Hello everyone, welcome to week 3 of ENST 420, the U.S. Environmental Movement. We are halfway through the course this week, and you are all doing very well, and I appreciate all the efforts that you've put into this point. Let's begin by reviewing week 2, the conservation-preservation debate. So conservation, as you saw, means use, and it's often termed as beneficial use. But the question that needs to really be asked every time someone tells you something is beneficial to whom? There are winners and losers in every decision that is made when it comes to the environment. So beneficial use is kind of one of those ambiguous terms until you really drill down and figure out who's winning and who's losing, or what is winning and what is losing. So here we bring in this intrinsic value of nature versus the instrumental value of nature. Use would mean instrumental value, but the winners and losers, in a logging operation could be some biota, some animal, anything, but it's important to think whenever there's a benefit to something, who or what is losing. And a hint here, something along those lines will be on your final exam. Okay, conservation means beneficial use or use, which would tend to lead to management. There have to be decisions made about what is going to remain and what is going to be taken away. And then this, especially in Pinchot's time, this meant extraction. The nation was still young in the early 1900s and still growing, quite rapidly growing. And so there was this need for things like copper for wire, for lighting in houses. That's an extraction-based industry. Mining. Think of Butte. Timber. Timber had to be harvested so that those houses could be built, and so that there would be factories built so people could make money to buy those houses. So it's all this interlinked use of the environment, but remember who benefits and who loses. So we're talking about this instrumental value of nature. Nature being a means to an end. A tree is a means to an end of a house. A tree is a means to an end of maybe a cooking fire. A tree is a means to an end of a factory being built. Those kinds of things. And you saw key figures of President Teddy Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot, our chief forester, first one for our nation, where trees were crops. And then Aldo Leopold, a conservationist trying to restore his Sand County farm in Wisconsin, trying to grapple with these ideas of what does conservation mean, and grappling with who wins and who loses. For those of you who know anything about the book, A Sand County Almanac, which I highly recommend you read, he had gone out, and this is not in that book, I don't think, but he had shot a wolf, and he got to the dying wolf in time to see this fierce green fire dying in her eyes. And this was like one of those poignant moments in life where something clicks in your brain and you start to reevaluate what is going on. So he was working through all of these thoughts that he had had before about what conservation was and what conservation really was. And this had to do with those questions of beneficial to whom. Shooting a wolf is beneficial to the hunter because then the wolf isn't eating the deer, but what was lost in the shooting of that wolf? So those are the kinds of questions we're looking at. And then preservation, of course, means to leave something in its natural state. Now, mostly we're talking about the environment and nature. You might remember that one of Muir's most famous quotes is that no holier temple had ever been consecrated to man than nature. And you'll remember that Muir was heavily influenced by Thoreau and Emerson, and seeing that these outdoor places, these wild places, were places to connect, to think, and to exercise our intelligence, and to revitalize our soul. So this is an intrinsic value versus an instrumental value. Nature having value as an end in itself. Its value is just by being there. Another hint for your final: instrumental and intrinsic value. What are they? What's the difference? And as we've said, a key figure for preservation was Muir. So lessons learned from that time moving forward were that the old idea that resources on the landscape were inexhaustible was untrue. Resources were exhaustible. This is something that was learned through time. Resources can be depleted. We know that today, but then it had to be learned. Also, management, even scientific management, can have unintended consequences. You might think of, okay, so we log this hillside, and so that takes out the beetle kill trees that would be bad for fire, but did we consider the fact that if we don't replant that slope and big rains come along, that will erode the soil into a stream and affect the fishery? The fishery wasn't even part of the initial, we need to cut that timber, but it can have unintended consequences. That's a simplistic example. I'm sure you can think of better ones. And then a lesson that we're still learning is that in this rapidly changing world, it can be difficult to keep people focused on a particular issue, like the environment. So during this whole time, Emerson and Thoreau, with these ideas that had not been expressed before, that nature was this place that we were losing, and then going into the conservation-preservation debate, beneficial use, beneficial to whom, and what do we lose in the process by cutting a tree, or damming a river, or extracting a resource. And as we talked about, Aldo Leopold, I think he sums it up pretty well, the struggle that he was facing in this quote. One of the penalties of an ecological education is that one lives alone in a world of wounds. Much of the damage inflicted on land is quite invisible to laymen. An ecologist must either harden his shell or make believe that the consequences of science are none of his business, or he must be the doctor who sees the marks of death in a community that believes itself well and does not want to be told otherwise. So this kind of thinking is still going on and still going forward, but what's happening also in the nation at the time is this back and forth of ideas, back and forth of political parties in power, back and forth of different presidents and different Congresses with different ideas of how the nation should be done. And then state to state, those same forces are working on these ideas. And this is a time of incredible change. And people like Leopold and people like Muir and people like Thoreau and Emerson were grappling with this kind of status quo and seeing, hey, there's something wrong. We need to figure this out. So now we're into the environmental movement, the beginning of it and the evolution of the movement. And we had talked about perhaps Thoreau, or some of you felt that Emerson were more of a catalyst, not necessarily the catalyst, of the environmental movement. I don't want to get into the A versus the debate. I think you guys did a really good job of pointing that out in that first forum, and I thank you for that and your attention to that. It was a great discussion there. But now let's look at what many consider the actual birth of the environmental movement, which was the publishing of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. Rachel Carson was a marine biologist who worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and she had always liked writing, and she ended up writing a book about the sea and having wondering, not wondering as in questioning, but a sense of wonder was one of her books. And it called for this, being excited about nature and being excited and curious about all the things that were happening in nature and how it was fascinating. And so she'd had some moderate success with that book, and her name was known. And as you know, if you like one book by a writer and you see their next book come out, oftentimes you're like, oh, I should read that. So that's what she had going for her when she published Silent Spring in 1962. This was a very different book, though. This book began when Carson received a letter from a friend of hers who was concerned about the DDT being sprayed in the ditches along the road where she walked every day to appreciate nature, particularly birds. And in the letter, she described how she and friends of hers from other places had, noticed that the spray goes on and suddenly there's no birds. There's no bird song. There's just no birds. And even finding dead birds or eggs, bird eggs with shells so thin that the egg never hatched, the baby bird never developed. And so she was curious about this, and having worked with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, she was able to do, she was very good at researching. So she began this 6-year research project about the effects of these chemicals on birds, but also on other wildlife, and even onto people. Now, you'll remember in 1945, we tested the first atomic bomb in the deserts outside of Alamogordo, New Mexico. And part of her research showed that this nuclear fallout was in lots and lots of things, far, far away from New Mexico. So this is also part of the book. So she researched it for 6 years, and when it came out, Silent Spring was an instant bestseller, one of the most talked about books in the decade of the 60s. One of the things that she did that people didn't like was she called into question the motives of these powerful chemical companies. DDT was actually used in the war to prevent malaria and typhus, and the government told us that it was safe. And so she called for people to question whether the government was doing enough to protect our life, whether they were telling us the whole story about some of the things. DDT at the time became so widely used, as many chemicals that are used during wartime. Once the war is over, these chemical companies are ramped up for production for war, and then they have all of this equipment, but the product is no longer needed. So they create the need. Marketing creates the need. And, who likes mosquitoes? I don't like them. And DDT was very effective against mosquitoes. So people would spray them. They had their kids spraying it. Trucks pulled up to public pools full of children and sprayed it all over everyone. And it was just this great thing because we weren't going to get malaria or any typhus or some of the other things from these terrible, terrible insects. And people didn't know that. People thought that DDT was safe. They had pictures at the time of trucks, government trucks driving down the road and spraying this cloud of DDT into the air, and kids following right on their back bumper, full-on force of this spray of DDT, riding along on their bicycles, happy as clams, completely unaware of what was happening and what this could mean long term. So she sounded the alarm. In the picture here you see the original cover of the book, and you also see where Ms. Carson was called before a congressional hearing because of her book. Many of the chemical company people were, it just really makes me angry when I read about this, because they called her names. It was during the Cold War, and she was called a communist. They said that since she wasn't married, what was she worried about genetics for? They called her a hysterical woman. They said her research was flawed. They just pulled out all the stops in trying to cast aspersions on her character. The American people, thankfully, had none of that. It was still a tough time for her, as you'll see in one of your readings this week. One really great quote that I like from the book Silent Spring is this. Carson says, "But man is a part of nature, and his war against nature is inevitably a war against himself." Silent Spring was, as I said, well received by the general public. They could understand it, and they could understand the implications of what was happening. And this fact awakened Americans to this inescapable tragedy and catastrophe of unrestricted consumption and environmental negligence. Now you might be saying, well, how does consumption what does that have to do with chemicals? Well, a lot. Because not only were these chemicals, insecticides, pesticides being used to make our fruit look perfect and to rid us of anything that would bother us or, bad pun here, bug us, but there were lots of other chemicals being pumped into the atmosphere and into water all around us because of factory processes. So this was part of that as well. There were many other books during this time, the 60s, that came out, but none was as effective as Silent Spring. Silent Spring was the overarching book that everyone kept going back to and everyone kept talking about. But as you can see, many authors participated in this sounding of the alarm that things weren't all they seemed. Social ecologist Murray Bookchin in 1962, same year as Silent Spring, published Our Synthetic Environment, where he connected these ideas of ecologically oriented social movements being essential to environmental and social health. So he's making this connection between the environment and people and the health of both. This harkens back to ideas of Thoreau and Emerson, and I'm sure previous to that, but that's where we started. Then there's the book Technics and Civilization by Lewis Mumford, also in 1962, and then So Human and Animal in 1968 by René Dubos. Both of those works and men contended that nature was being permanently damaged by human action. I just heard on the news this week, I believe it was former New York City Mayor Giuliani. Yeah, it was him. And he's got some new program about community-based answers to climate change. So he was stumping for that on some news program. And he said, it isn't that the administration doesn't believe in climate change, it's that they don't believe that it's human-caused. And here we see, clear back in 1968, that was a debate that was going on even then, that human-caused problems are creating damage to the environment. Just interesting how all of this stuff kind of weaves its way through time. Then in 1963, Barry Commoner had Science and Survival, and then in 72, Barry Commoner had a bestseller called The Closing Circle. Both of those books and Barry Commoner were very popular. His writing was easy to read, and it combined science and moral sensibility. So that kind of still goes along with the theme of Silent Spring. You know, what are we putting into our environment, which is then going into our bodies, and is that responsible? And then something else you'll read a little bit about is The Population Bomb, published in 1968 by Paul Ehrlich, which was a bestseller. It talked about the dangers of overpopulation and the Earth having a carrying capacity. This was a neo-Malthusian idea and was highly controversial. For those of you who don't know, there was a preacher by the last name of Malthus in the 1700s, I believe, who had these ideas of overpopulation. It was highly controversial in whatever church he was preaching in, that, we need to limit human population growth because the planet can only feed and house so many of us. So this was a revival of that kind of thought, and it was just as controversial as it was hundreds of years earlier. So also following Silent Spring, there was this catalyst of environmental laws, and this showed progress for the movement going forward. A Land and Water Conservation Fund was proposed by President Kennedy in 1962. Congress didn't set up the fund until 1965, so there was some debate going on about what was to happen with that law and how it was to be funded and what it meant. So after all of those amendments were taken care of, 3 years later, Congress finally funded that. Then the Clean Air Act of 1963, which would use federal funds to fight air pollution. The Wilderness Act of 1964, which established the National Wilderness Preservation System. The National Environmental Policy Act of 1969. This was one of the first national laws of overarching protection across the country for the environment. It required environmental impact statements for federally funded projects and established the EPA to enforce statutes. And then the Clean Water Act of 1972, which would regulate pollutants released into waterways and mandate restoration of polluted waters for recreational use. I tried to find a picture, but I could not find one, which would show the Clark Fork River in Missoula back during this time. And the Clark Fork River was not necessarily any different than any other river in that it was riddled with garbage. People would take truckloads of household waste back up to the bank of the river and dump it off in there and let it float away or wherever it went. And this was not anything exclusive to Missoula. This went on often nationwide. Many, many places did this. There weren't dumps and such. There weren't necessarily garbage collectors in all smaller areas, and people would just dump their trash into the river. And for those of you who are aware of the Clark Fork Coalition, there is still garbage being put into the river, whether knowingly or unknowingly or accidentally. But they have the Clark Fork cleanup every year in April. And the Bitterroot Water Forum does one on the Bitterroot River, and then I'm not sure what group, but there's one up the Blackfoot that does a cleanup as well. And they get everything from cars to beer cans or beer bottles out of the river every spring. And as much as they get, if you've ever participated in one of these, the poundage that they get is crazy. You would think that we were more highly evolved than to be dumping our trash in the river. But the good thing is that through the years they're noticing that there's less and less of it. So not only does the cleanup clean the river, but it provides an education medium to tell people this is not where you put your trash. So we're still working on that today in communities, not just in Montana, not just in western Montana, but throughout the United States. Think of American Rivers Organization. So anytime you have a movement and there's, it starts to wane after a while, people move on to the next thing. And today I think we do that quite a bit quicker than perhaps we did in the 60s. But During that time, in the 60s, catastrophes in the news kept people motivated. So there was a Santa Barbara oil spill, and there were many oil spills, and still are. Many of them just are not, they don't make the national news. There was a seizure of 11 tons of coho salmon in Wisconsin and Minnesota due to DDT contamination, which, that was right along with what Carson was saying in her book. There was the application for permit to build the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. There was the burning of the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, Ohio. This river actually caught on fire several times through the years. So Cleveland is an industrial city. Before the Clean Water Act, lots of wastes were pumped right into the river, and there was no penalty for that. So there's this film of petroleum products and different chemicals floating on top of the river, and then there's some trash that accumulates on it, and then something sparks and sets it on fire. And so this river burned many times back then, before these laws that we talked about. And then if you look at the picture in the upper right there, that is the LA skyline. And during the 60s, there were smog alerts that prohibited children from playing inside or out. Parents and schools were told to not even let their children skip rope or skip or jump around in the house. The air was so bad. And this picture, it reminds me a lot of the pictures that we see often of Beijing today. So there were early conservation groups that started even before Carson's book, like the Sierra Club, founded in 1892 by John Muir. There was the National Audubon Society. It started as local societies before it became national. It was founded in the 1890s as a series of local chapters, and that was to raise awareness of bird plumage used in stylish hats of the day, and it was to say, stop taking these feathers off of these birds. They're beautiful, but leave them on the birds. Then the Isaac Walton League. That was founded in 1922 by Isaac Walton, who was the author of The Complete Angler. For those of you who are fisher people out there, you'll know what that book is. And he was focused on conservation and keeping waters clean so that they could be great fisheries and be used for the recreation of fishing. And then there's the League of Conservation Voters, founded in 1970 to track voting records and policy decisions for Congress members. This group is still active today, very active today. So amid growing national anger over pollution and other environmental threats to human health in the late 60s and early 70s, most of these early groups ended up serving as a place where many people started their foray into environmentalism. But then they would see perhaps that some of these groups were focused on particular areas or particular issues that either didn't appeal to them or that they wanted to be more active in a different way. So that they would go on to other groups that weren't maybe so narrowly focused. So all of this hoopla around Silent Spring ended up, sparking Earth Day, the first Earth Day, April 22nd, 1970, which marked the official start of the Green Decade. 20 million Americans participated nationwide in that first Earth Day, which spotlighted issues like thermal pollution in the atmosphere, later talked about as the hole in the ozone, dying lakes, the glut of solid waste, industrial and personal waste, strip mining, oil spills, and dwindling natural resources. Back to this, there's a carrying capacity. Resources are not unlimited. And most of these gatherings nationwide emphasize that consumerism and industrial growth are the main sources of environmental ills. Again, attaching humans and in this case, in our case, Americans, to this degradation of the environment that we live in. Also beginning at the end of the 60s were the Nixon years, and many of these environmental laws that maybe were previously on the books were updated, or new laws were brought into play. When Nixon campaigned for the presidency, he did not talk about the environment at all. It wasn't even on his agenda. But it became very clear to him when he set foot into the White House that he was going to have to do something about some of these environmental degradations. The people were just too in tune to it for him to ignore it. He was going to have to do something. So environmental laws that were passed were the Clean Air Act of 1970, where the federal law regulates emissions from vehicles and industries. Prior to this, industries could emit whatever, whenever, and wherever with really no penalty. The previous Clean Air Act was just ignored. And so this was a new act that really tied some penalties for non-compliance. The Clean Water Act of 1972 was an update of the 1948 Act that regulated where water pollutants could be sent and how they were to be treated. And then the Endangered Species Act of 1973. This is still very effective today. It protects plants and animals to preserve them and to make sure that they're not threatened within their habitats. So as I talked about a minute ago, two types of groups were formed after the first Earth Day: mainstream groups and alternative groups. So for the mainstream groups, the focus was on legislative, administrative, and regulatory action. That was a focus in the electoral sphere and in the courts. And the result that a lot of these mainstream groups got was they were able to influence and participate in politics, and that continued to increase through time, their involvement there, and they were able to actively influence environmental policies. Now, for some people, that wasn't enough. That was too slow a process, too long of a process, and for some it was just distasteful to have to deal with government officials. So they sought other alternative groups where they could put their energies. And those groups, the alternative groups, focused on direct action, protests that would bring awareness to the issues, and civil disobedience. One that I recall from my childhood was, I think the woman's name was, she was known as Butterfly, and this was all over the national news that she had climbed a tree somewhere in the west, I think in the northwest, and she lived in that tree for days and days to keep them from cutting it down. She was protesting the cutting of old-growth forests, and this made national news and raised awareness for people, as far away as Florida or wherever, that there were these really great old-growth forests that were being cut down just for somebody to make a profit, that there were other places we could cut timber that weren't, maybe as costly to the environment. So that's kind of an example of what was going on then. And then for those of you who know Ed Abbey, an environmental writer, he wrote the book The Monkey Wrench Gang, and so it was these individual people, sometimes very small groups. You had to really trust them, and it was supposed to be these non-violent, non-harmful ways of protesting environmental damages done. For instance, in Colorado, this was a small group of people painted a crack. In the middle of the night, they painted a crack on a dam that was damming a river, and I believe it was the Colorado River. And just showing, that that dam was a man-made thing that perhaps shouldn't be there. People who participated in these alternative groups often felt empowered, and many of them ended up fighting for environmental justice. Some of you may know that, in Louisiana, around New Orleans, that's called Cancer Alley because there are so many toxic waste dumps. So you've heard maybe of NIMBY, NIMBY, not in my backyard. Who would want a toxic dump, waste dump, in their backyard? Well, people who live in Cancer Alley tend to be low-income minorities, and so they don't have the power or the voice to be able to protest these things. So in this case, in Louisiana, that's where these toxic dumps land, and there's a higher rate of disease there. So it was beneficial to someone else that these things weren't put in their backyard, but it was not beneficial to those who live in Cancer Alley. Moving on, the alternative groups, the result of their actions was that it gave this counterculture view a way to influence and participate and feel part of the movement and to make progress for the movement. So these are particular examples of groups, mainstream groups and alternative groups. This is not a comprehensive list, but you will be using this list. So here's one of the assignments. This is for one of your forum posts this week. Your readings are light so that you can spend a little bit more time on this forum post. So you're going to pick either a mainstream or an alternative group from the previous slide. If you don't see a group on that list that you want to look at, find one. Choose one that you already know something about. Maybe it's the Clarkport Coalition. Maybe it's the Blackfoot Challenge. Maybe it's a different group. Maybe it's a group that you've worked with or would like to work with. Trout Unlimited, for instance. But maybe it's a group that challenges what you think, that disagrees with what you want to do and what you think. This is all going to tie in to your final paper. So to make this profitable, pick a group that has something to do with what your final paper will be about. So for instance, if you're going to do your final paper on educating children about the environment, you might want to look at something like the Montana Natural History Center or Watershed Education Network or something like that. If you have questions about what group to pick, I don't care what group you pick. As long as it has something to do with your thesis for your final paper, something to do with where you're going in that's fine with me. But if you have questions, feel free to email me. Once you've picked that group, do research on that group. When were they established? Who was their founder? What's the purpose and goal of the group? And other questions. This is just to get you started. But it is going to be a quick summary. You might want to dig more into the group, but for your forum post, you're going to write one paragraph. Let me say it again. One paragraph about this group. What is their purpose? What is their goal? And how do they directly or indirectly but concretely affect the subject of your final paper? So that's one single paragraph telling us about the group and how it connects to you. Could just be an interest that you have. It doesn't have to be, some solid experience that you've had. Then you're going to summarize all that research into a single paragraph. It would just be like your elevator speech. An elevator ride is like 3 minutes. So if somebody said, oh, I see you have on National Wildlife Federation shirt. What do they do? It's that. Something you can tell somebody about the group to maybe spark their interest or maybe make them hate that group, depending on your view. How can you explain that quickly? So that's one single paragraph. And then in a separate single paragraph, that's when you go into how this affects what you plan to write on, what you plan to do. And so that's a 2-paragraph post in the forum. and you're going to cite your sources at the end, and that can just be in a list. So I think that's pretty self-explanatory. If you have questions, be sure to email me, and happy reading this week.